Okay, so we're going to get into our applicable sUAS regulations when looking at our FAA Part 107 Remote Pilot's License. There's a lot to go over here and a lot of general content when preparing for the Part 107. This is going to be one of our first initial kind of overviews to get started and to understand some of the general and more wide-ranging regulations. We'll be getting into actual flight maps and flight planning a little bit later. So, according to 14 CFR Part 107, in order to actually go forward and apply for a remote pilot certificate with an sUAS rating, you have to go through and satisfy the following eligibility requirements. So we have to be able to pass our initial aeronautical knowledge test at an FAA-approved knowledge testing center. You must be at least 16 years of age. You must be in a physical and mental condition that would not interfere with the safe operation of an sUAS. You must be able to read, write, and understand the English language, though there are exceptions that may be given due to medical reasons. And you must be able to pass a background check by the TSA. But just so you know, as soon as you submit your application, the TSA background check starts. If you fail the exam, like most certificates, you have to wait a certain period of time before you're allowed to resit for the exam, and that duration is 14 days. That's actually a pretty standard duration for most industry certs, whether it's for the FAA or say like Cisco or anything along those lines. So that's pretty standard. So a civil small unmanned aircraft, that's what sUAS means, must meet the following criteria. So it must weigh less than 55 pounds, including everything that is on board or otherwise attached to an aircraft. When we're talking about the size of an sUAS, 55, if it's over 55 pounds, that is a really, really big drone. Most drones are sitting in the 15 to 20 pound range, and those are pretty big. You can find a lot smaller ones that are typically in like the 5 pound range. You can even find ones that are just pretty lightweight too, like the DJI minis. So must weigh less than 55 pounds. And when we're talking about everything including on board, we're talking about say like any cameras or other equipment that might be on board. Now this is pretty important because drones are getting a lot more usage in a lot of different other areas, including say like agriculture, for crop dusting, and also for using for say like cell phone tower inspection as well. So we have to be able to think about all the different kind of ways that we can utilize it. Other things, they must be operated without the possibility of, or they are operated without the possibility of direct human intervention from within or on the aircraft as well. Registration of the sUAS is required by 14 CFR Part 48. So what this means is that any sUAS in between the weight of about 0.55 pounds and 55 pounds must be registered with the FAA. So that pretty much means almost any device that you use has to be weighed or registered. You must also be at least 13 years of age in order to register an sUAS. And if the owner is less than 13, then the sUAS must be registered by a person who is at least 13 years of age or older. So one thing to kind of note with the registration side of things, the registration also has to be displayed on the device itself as well. So it has to be written down. It can be stored on the inside of say like a battery compartment, but it must be able to be easily accessible without any usage of a tool in order to pry it open. So it doesn't have to be prominently like stuck right there in front of everything. Additionally, one thing to note, I know my slide says part 103. It's part 107. Sorry, that's a little typo there. It does not apply. In fact, I'll fix that right now because that's going to bug me. So part 107. So part 107 does not apply to the following devices. So it doesn't apply to amateur rockets, moored balloons, or unmanned free balloons, kites, public aircraft operations, operations conducted outside of the U.S., or air carrier operations. So in accordance with Part 101, Subpart E of model aircraft rules, Part 107 does not apply to model aircraft flown strictly for hobby or recreation use. So I guess to kind of pause and why 107 is important is part 107 is important if you're going to be flying it for commercial usage. So if you're going to be utilizing this for, say, taking pictures of homes for real estate, that requires the operator, to have a Part 107 license. So also according, so in the same vein, I kind of already mentioned this earlier with registration markings. So while we have to mark it, again, in accordance with 14 CFR Part 48, before you operate your sUAS, it must be marked to identify it that it has been registered by the FAA, and this applies to both hobbyist or commercial sUAS operators. So regardless of whether you're going to be going for your Part 107 certification, if you're going to be operating an sUAS within that 0.55 pounds to 55 pound range, you have to register your sUAS with the FAA. So number must also be eligible and or legible and durable as well, such as permanent marker or self-adhesive label, and the number must also be visible and accessible without the use of any tools, like I kind of just already said. So other things to kind of note, FAA allows numbers to be inside of the sUAS, but again, like I said, if it needs to be inspected at any point in time, you can't go through and pry it open. It needs to be able to be easily accessible. One thing that's pretty cool, there is a website out there in an organization called reclaimdrone.com. They'll go out and they'll print a sticker for you. It looks nice and easy, and it makes it easy for you to display your registration number. Cost-wise, pretty effective. It's only $5–10. So other things to kind of look at too, for foreign registration. So if an sUAS is going to be registered in a foreign country, or if a UA is owned or controlled or operated by someone who's not a U.S. citizen, then the remote pilot in command, also known as the remote PIC, must obtain a foreign aircraft permit before conducting any operations. So that's something to kind of keep in mind. Other things, recertification requirements, and for any types of like change of address. Remote pilots must renew their Part 107 cert every 2 years or 24 months, tomato. And you have to take the exam at a authorized CATS or PSI exam testing center. Now with COVID currently being in place, these testing centers are being allowed, the Part 107 is available for you to take online, so that's kind of a nice thing. So you don't have to go to a testing center anymore. We'll see if that sticks around after this kind of all wraps up. Other things to note too is that if you have a change of address, remote pilots must notify the FAA within 30 days. So going over conditions for safe flight operation. So an FAA airworthiness certification for your sUAS is not required for operation. However, the remote pilot in command, PIC, must maintain and inspect the sUAS prior to each flight to ensure that it is in condition for safe operation. FAA typically requires that owners follow their manufacturer's guideline as to determine what's safe and unsafe. Now, one thing to note with that is a lot of manufacturers won't actually provide any form of, say, like a maintenance procedure or checklist. So if that does not exist, what you need to make sure that you do is be able to keep a journal of any maintenance and repairs that you yourself have to do. So, so basically a flight log is highly, highly recommended if there is no manufacturer procedure or checklist prior to flight. So that's going to come up, and that does actually typically come up in your Part 107 exam. So there's typically a couple questions that will relate to that type of thing. So make sure that you're aware of that. Accident reporting. So this is another important thing that you'll likely get a couple questions on in Part 107. So the remote pilot in command is required to report accidents to the FAA within 10 days following serious accident to a person or damage to property in excess of $500, excluding your sUAS. So if I'm flying my sUAS and it crashes, and my sUAS is more than $500, I don't have to report it to the FAA. It's only if I crash it into someone else's property, or into another person. Now the FAA defines a serious injury to a person as someone losing consciousness, breaking a bone, or a skin laceration that requires some form of stitches. Physical damage is going to be reported. So if I crash my sUAS into, say, like a window and it breaks the window, but as long as the cost to repair that item is no more than $500, not including the cost to repair the sUAS, I don't have to report it. So for instance, if I damage an item that's worth $1,000, but the cost to repair is only $450, then it's okay. It doesn't have to be reported. But if the cost to repair is more than $500, you have to report it to the FAA within 10 days. So, pilot and command requirements. So an sUAS operation may involve one individual or team of crew members, which can consist of the remote pilot and command, a different person who is manipulating the remote controls, and a visual observer, or a VO. So this is important to note, is that the person who is actually operating the sUAS does not actually have to be Part 107 certified, but they do have to be underneath the supervision of someone who is Part 107 certified. So a person that holds a current remote pilot certificate with an sUAS rating and has the final authority and responsibility for the operation and safety of the sUAS. So all pre-flight inspection, the remote pilot and command has to be able to quickly take control of the controllers, and those are things that we have to kind of look at as well. So if a pilot's actually flying, or if a person who's manipulating the controls is flying and it's looking like it's going to crash or it's in danger, the remote pilot and command has to be able to actually take control quickly. Then we also have the visual observer. So this is another person of our flight crew. So a person acting as a flight crew member basically is just there to be able to see and avoid air traffic or other objects in the sky, either overhead or other things on the ground. So we kind of went over most of this, but I'll go over it a little bit more. So the remote pilot in command must be designated before each flight, but that can change during the flight, provided the remote pilot can ensure the operation and poses no undue hazard to people, aircraft, or property. So basically, if there's two Part 107 certified people, one is designated, and as long as it's safe to transfer over between the two sides, it can. So again, in the event of the loss of control, the remote PIC has to be able to must comply with all applicable regulations of Part 107. Basically, it means they have to take over controls of the flight, and if anything happens, such as it crashes, they have to follow the proper regulations. The person manipulating the controls, that's any non-certified person that's actually operating the sUAS. Now, this is an important thing too, is again, from a hobby perspective, I don't have to be Part 107 certified, but if I'm using it commercially, we do. So if this is, so a person manipulating the controls for underneath Part 107 is someone who's operating the sUAS commercially. So again, whether they're going to be, using it for, say, agriculture usage, such as like crop dusting, inspecting cell phone towers, taking pictures of houses for real estate, that's kind of the primary thing that you'll see. But they have to be underneath the direct supervision of someone who has their Part 107. And then the visual observer, again, it's not required to have a visual observer for any flight, but their job, if you choose to have someone as in the role of a visual observer, is to basically advise and look for any potential hazards that might be occurring. So that's the primary idea. So there are operating rules as well that we have to look at. So Part 107 prohibits operations of a small UAS at night, so commercially between the end of evening civil twilight and the beginning of morning civil twilight. So when we're talking about that, what does that actually mean? It's the period of sunset until 30 minutes after sunset, and morning means period of 30 minutes prior to sunrise. In Alaska, it's a little bit different because of their constantly having either a lot more daylight or having a lot less. So that one, you have to look at the Federal Air Almanac in order to actually make that determination. So when the sUAS operations are conducted during those hours, the sUAS must, so if it's conducted afterwards or if it's being conducted during civil twilight, the sUAS has to be equipped with additional components such as anti-collision lights that are capable of being visible for at least 3 statute miles. So Part 107 permits the remote pilot to reduce the intensity of the lighting if she or he has determined it would be in the interest of operational safety to do so. So a commercial drone operator is restricted to daylight flying hours only unless the UA has anti-collision lights installed. But grand scheme of things, most things are just going to be during daylight hours. Visual line of sight operation as well is important. So the sUAS has to remain within your line of sight or the line of sight of flight crew members unaided by any other device other than, say, glasses. Now, one thing that's important to note is you can use, say, binoculars to take a closer look at the device itself or at the sUAS. In order to make sure that it's safe or that there's nothing else going around, but you can't use that for a long period of time. It's only there for corrective or controlled observation. So you have to be able to immediately and keep it in your line of sight. So minimum visibility as observed from the location of the control station must be no less than 3 miles. Minimum distance from clouds must be no less than 500 feet below cloud and 2,000 feet horizontally from the cloud, and crew members must be able to see the small unmanned aircraft at all times during flight. So that's a couple of the things that kind of get into it is that in kind of the next thing I'm going to get into in kind of our next chapter, when we start looking at actual flight paths, that changes when we're in controlled airspace. And we have different controlled airspace that we have to think about as well. So, so kind of went over that top one already. But regaining visual line of sight. So the remote PIC or person manipulating the controls may have brief moments when she or he is not looking directly at or cannot see the sUAS, but still retains the capability to see it quickly again or to be able to quickly maneuver it back into line of sight. And that's okay. So basically, if it's out of your sight for just a small period of time, that's fine and it can come back, but you have to make sure that it's not going to stay out of your line of sight for a long period of time. So a couple of examples of when you might see this is the safety of the operation, such as briefly looking down at your control station or scanning the airspace. So, you know, if I have to look at my controller to make sure that it's okay to operate, or if I have to, you know, look around the sky and scan to make sure that there's nothing around where I'm going to be flying as well, that's okay. Scanning for traffic, same thing, kind of for any other devices flying around you. The crew or remote PIC should systematically focus on different segments of the sky for short intervals, and we'll talk about like how to scan and how to do kind of overlapping scanning when you're kind of looking around. And then operational necessities such as intentionally maneuvering the aircraft for a brief period behind an obstruction. There's no specific time interval for which interruption or visual contact is permissible. So what we're talking about there is, you know, if I'm flying my drone, say like behind a radio tower, and I can still, I know where it is, I have full control over it, that's still in the realm of okay from a commercial standpoint. So scanning techniques. So essentially to scan effectively, pilots should be looking from right to left or left to right, and then they should be scanning at the farthest distance away from them that can be perceived, and then moving slowly back towards the bottom and to the actual position of the aircraft as a whole. So when you're scanning, per FAA guidelines, they recommend you scan an area approximately 30 degrees wide. And the duration of each stop should be roughly about have about a 10-degree overlap, and you should be scanning and stopping for about 2 to 3 seconds as you kind of go through it. So operating limits. You're also going to see some questions about this on the Part 107 exam. So Part 107 can't be flown any faster than a ground speed of 100 miles per hour, which is 87 knots. That is a really, really fast drone. If you're flying something at over 100 miles an hour as a drone, yeah, it's moving. So you can't fly any faster than that. Also, it can't be flown higher than 400 feet above ground level. You'll see the acronym AGL, that just stands for above ground level, unless it's flown within a 400-foot radius of a structure such as a building or a cell tower. So you can't go over 400 feet typically. There's some caveats to that. Then the remote PIC may fly 400 feet above the uppermost top of the structure. So if I have, say, a cell tower, you know, that's 1,000 feet tall, and I'm flying commercially to do an inspection of that cell tower, I can actually fly my drone up that 1,000 feet and then 400 feet above it, so I can actually go 1,400 feet up. with the drone. So that's a thing to kind of know. Otherwise, if I'm not around any actual building or cell tower, I have to stay under 400 feet. With an asterisk, because that's not always the case, but typically it is. It can also not be flown lower than 2,000 feet above ground level over national parks, so such as national monuments or recreational areas, and locations administered by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services and the U.S. Forest Services. So you're not permitted to fly at all within a national park or monument without prior authorization. One thing that we'll kind of talk about is how to apply for those waivers. It's actually probably one of the most common waivers that people will actually file for, is to be able to fly in sUAS in, say, a national park or a monument. So another thing to kind of know, if the structure is, say, like something like a communication tower with guy wires, the FAA actually recommends that the remote PIC fly no closer than 2,000 feet horizontally to the actual structure. However, that's just a recommendation. There's no law or rule that's going to prohibit you from flying any closer to that. So, other things. Other additional operating limits for the sUAS. Operation near aircraft, which is basically our right-of-way rules. So no person may operate an sUAS in a manner that interferes with the operations and traffic patterns to any airport, heliport, or seaplane base. The remote PIC has a sole responsibility to remain clear of and yield the right-of-way to all other aircraft, manned or unmanned, and avoid other potential hazards that may affect the remote PIC's operation of the aircraft. This is traditionally referred to as see and avoid. To satisfy this responsibility, the remote PIC must go over the following. So be aware of other aircrafts, persons, and property in the vicinity of the operating area. Know the location and flight path of his or her sUAS at all times. Be able to maneuver your sUAS to avoid collision and prevent other aircraft from having to take evasive action. Avoid operating anywhere where the presence of his or her sUAS may interfere with operations at an airport, such as approach corridors, taxiways, runways, or helipads, and yield right-of-way to all the aircraft, including aircraft operating on the surface of the airport. Other things that are very important, you can't operate over people at all. So you may not commercially operate an sUAS directly over any person unless that person is going to be directly out of harm's way in the event that the item's gonna, if the item falls, the sUAS falls or has some issue. So with a small caveat of if the crew members are also involved, they do not have, you can operate around them as well. So anyone that's directly involved in the actual flight operation, that's okay. So visual observer, crew member, the remote PIC that's observing, or that's okay. But if there's others that are not a part of the crew members, then they must be in some form of safe cover, whether that's inside, say, like a stationary vehicle or some other type of protective structure. So protecting non-participants. So to comply with the limitations of the sUAS operations near persons not participating in the operation, the remote PIC should employ strategies that will protect people uninvolved with a flight, such as the following. So one, make sure that you're selecting an appropriate operation area for the flight, so something that's going to be sparsely populated. If operating in populated areas, make a plan to keep non-participants clear, indoors or undercover. If operating from a moving vehicle, choose a sparsely populated or unpopulated area, and make a plan to keep your sUAS clear of anyone who might approach it, and adopt an appropriate operating distance from non-participants to take reasonable precautions to keep the operational area free of all non-participants. So this one might be a little bit of a head scratcher, because, you know, at least when I was first going through it, I was like, well, who would want to fly a drone out of a car or a boat? But I was like, and I thought, you know, I was like, oh, well, an airplane too, is that possible? No, that one's not. But you can, there are guidelines for operating an sUAS from a moving vehicle. So it can be any ground or so land or waterborne vehicle. It is permitted under Part 107 to fly an sUAS from either of those options. However, it's not permitted to fly an sUAS while in an aircraft underneath Part 107. But it's only allowed over sparsely populated or unpopulated areas. So the remote PIC and person manipulating the controls, if applicable, must still maintain visual line of sight of the sUAS operating from either a moving ground-based or watercraft. Operations over persons are also still directly not okay, so it's not permitted unless they're already under safe cover, and so same thing, it's not prohibited. Visual observer and remote pilot also must still maintain effective communication. And any, this is kind of an obvious one, but they always put it in there, careless or reckless operation of an sUAS is obviously prohibited. So, you know, trying to fly it too close to the actual, say, a car or, you know, boat that you're riding in, that's going to be, or trying to, you know, fly low and buzz over it, that's considered reckless. So operating an sUAS while driving a moving vehicle is considered to be careless or reckless. So obviously, if you're the one driving the boat or the car, you can't also fly the drone or sUAS. Vice versa, if you're the Part 107 certified flyer, you can't be driving and have another person manipulating the controls, because that violates the original idea of you're unable, if in the event that you have to take control of the sUAS, you would be unable to do so. So the remote PIC has to be, say, like the passenger in the car if there's another person manipulating, or they have to be the person actually flying themselves, and that's basically where it comes down to. Another pretty common one, no operating while impaired in any way, shape, and form. So you can't, so FAA really takes this one very seriously in terms of DUI, drug offenses, or any types of other types of like drugs or alcohol are strictly forbidden while operating. So not only that, but any person that is a part of the sUAS crew of the flight operation cannot have consumed alcohols or drugs prior to the flight, or so at least preceding. So like for alcoholic beverages, any alcoholic beverage consumed, they can't be a part of it within at least an 8-hour time frame. So if you're under the influence of alcohol or have a blood alcohol concentration of a 0.04 or higher, you're not allowed to do it. Also, if there's any drug that's going to affect your mental or physical capabilities, so this can even just be stuff that's over the counter as well. Sometimes those might cause some form of impairment, so you're not going to be allowed to operate or be a part of the crew as well during those times. So general idea, kind of pretty straightforward. One thing to kind of note with this is that, again, the FAA, like I said, does take this very seriously. So if you are convicted of an alcohol or drug-related offense, pilots will face their license or certification being suspended for at least 1 year from the date of conviction. In addition, any refusal to submit to an alcohol or drug test also constitutes a revocation and basically a suspension for up to a year from the time of the refusal date. And so the FAA actually doesn't administer any of these drug or alcohol tests, but if you refuse a test from law enforcement, it's essentially seen as the exact same and is treated the same, and the FAA will still revoke your cert. So certificate of waivers. So Part 107 includes the option to apply for a certificate of waiver, or a COW, which will allow an sUAS operation to deviate from certain provisions of Part 107 if the FAA administrator finds that the proposed operation can be safely conducted under the terms submitted in this COW. So a list of the waivable sections are as follows. Operation from a moving vehicle or aircraft. However, no waiver of this provision will be issued to allow the carriage of property of another by aircraft for compensation or hire. Daylight operations. Request to operate at night. That's also one of the probably most common waivers that you'll see. Visual line of sight aircraft operation. But no waiver of this provision will be issued to allow the carrying of property of another by aircraft or for compensation or hire. A visual observer, operation of multiple small unmanned aircraft systems, yielding the right of way, operation over people, and operation in certain airspace. And that's not the same as controlled airspace. Remember that operation in certain airspace, we're going back to talking about, say, like operating all the way back in, say, like national parks or monuments. So how do we do it? How do you apply for a COW? So it's actually FAA makes it pretty easy, and they actually have a lot of really good information on this site, and it's a little hard to see, but it's the FAAdronezone.faa.gov, and basically you'll go there, you can find the link to it, follow the instructions. It's pretty straightforward, and more times than not, COWs are going to be approved if they're within reason. So like flying at night, pretty common, that's okay. Flying in national parks, depending on your location, and as long as you're not going to be flying over other people, those ones typically get approved as well, within reason. So although not required by Part 107, the FAA encourages applicants to submit their application at least 90 days prior to the start of any proposed operation. So the FAA will try and complete a review and adjudication of waivers within 90 days. However, the time required for the FAA to make a determination regarding waiver requests can vary based on the complexity of the request. So if it's something pretty simple, normally they can chew through it in a couple days or less. I've had like a nighttime one approved in a day or less. But that's because I was flying in a area that was sparsely populated, in proper airspace, and I had everything all properly set up. So but flying in other areas, that's a little bit more complicated. So if it's granted, that cert will include specific and special provisions designed to ensure that the sUAS operation may be conducted as safely as one conducted under the provisions of Part 107. So, other things. So government entities or organizations such as public universities, state governments, law enforcement agencies, and local municipalities have two options for operating an sUAS. They may either operate under Title 14 CFR Part 107 or obtain a COA Certificate of Waiver of Authorization to be allowed to operate an sUAS in all Class G airspace below 400 feet above ground level. So self-certification of the sUAS pilot along with the option to obtain an emergency COA under special circumstances. And again, I'll talk about the different types of airspace later in kind of my next chapter here. So certification requirements. Remote pilots must renew their certification every 2 years by taking an exam at an authorized CATS or PSI exam testing center. Cost to review will be applicable, recurring cost at that point in time. Remote pilots that hold a current Part 107 cert must notify the FAA of a change of address within 30 days. I've kind of already been over that. Failure to do so, however, will prohibit the pilot in control to commercially operate their sUAS until the FAA has been notified. And again, same thing. It's pretty easy to do. You just have to submit it online to the FAA Airmen Services website. Situational awareness. The remote pilot in command attains situational awareness by obtaining as much information as possible prior to a flight and becoming familiar with the performance capabilities of the sUAS. Weather conditions surrounding airspace, and air traffic control requirements. Sources of information include a weather briefing, ATC, FAA, local pilots, and landowners. Technologies such as global positioning, so GPS, mapping systems, computer applications can assist in collecting and managing information to improve your situational awareness and risk-based aeronautical decision-making, ADM. One app that you can use, it's actually a really cool app, it's called hoverapp.io. I'm kind of covering up a little bit over here, but hoverapp.io. Pretty cool one. Allows you to check for flight conditions, weather, temporary flight restrictions. It's nice. Is free, but you can also pay a little bit too. So FAA administration inspections. So any officer of the FAA administrator is allowed to make any test or inspection of a sUAS, the remote PIC, your visual observer, your flight logs, or any other documents, records, or reports, including asking to see a copy of your remote pilot certificate or any other documentation that's laid out in Part 107, without any advance notice or publication. So basically, if they ask to see something, you have to be able to provide it as per Part 107 states. So that's also why it's really important that, you know, if your sUAS that you purchase doesn't have a pre-flight checklist to kind of go through, that's why it's highly recommended that you keep a pre-flight inspection log and make sure that you have a flight record as well. So it's very important that you log all those things. It's basically along the lines of, if you don't log it, how do you know that you did it? So logging, just like in networking and security, probably one of the most important things that you can kind of go through and do. Advisory curriculars, AC, refer to a type of publication offered by the FAA. and are issued to inform the public of non-regulatory materials such as notices or reference materials. The FAA advisory circulars are available to all pilots via download from the FAA website, and they're not binding. So unless incorporated into a regulation by specific reference, and those have specific reference numbers, which is 60, 70, and 90. Falsification, alterations, and reproductions. Basically, long and short, it's a big no-no. If you do any of that, say goodbye to your Part 107 certification. So any fraudulent or intentionally false record or report that is required to be made, kept, or showed, or used to show compliance without any requirement under this part. So and any reproduction or alteration for fraudulent purpose or any certification, rating, authorization, record, or report. Engaging in any of that, like I said, one, you'll have a denial of an application for a remote pilot certificate, denial of a certificate of waiver, suspension or revocation of your cert or waiver, and potentially civil penalties such as a fine or worse. So yay. So that's kind of the general gist of it. So hopefully that was useful for kind of going through stuff. Yeah, I'll have more later. Have a good one.